Welcome, Professor O'Brien.
I got through finally. I've never used Twitter Spaces before, so this is all new to me.
Well, welcome and good evening.
Delighted to be here. How you all doing?
Very well, very well. We, as you will have heard from Francis and others, we've been online since, the start of this phase of the invasion, 24/7, with a bunch of volunteers, an ever-growing army of volunteers, I have to say. And we've been in support of Maria Aid, a charity now, founded by the leading staff and the former last commander of the Canadian Armed Forces training the Ukrainian Armed Forces, who couldn't stand it idly by. So we take this very seriously, and we like to present some create information awareness and present some facts and good experts. So we're delighted having you with us, so we can talk a little bit about the current state of affairs and the strategic impact. And
Sure.
Given the discussions which have emanated today out of Mr. Erdogan's pursued grain deal and the likes, and the new tactical situation on the ground.
Yep.
ATACMS being not just rumored, but seemingly en route, and the impact of HIMARS on the battlefield. I think there's so many things to talk about.
Yep.
But maybe you could just introduce briefly as to your background and what you've been doing in the past. Not everyone is familiar with you. I apologize.
Sure.
We tweeted it out beforehand, but I'm sure people would like to hear it from you.
No, absolutely. I mean, this has been a fascinating experience on how this has all come about and to why I'm speaking to you. I'm a professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews, and what that means is I do study war and conflict. I have primarily been working in 20th century and some a little bit in 21st, but 20th century war. My interests go back, probably my most well-known research is actually on air and sea power in the Second World War and logistics as well. So if I say my real specialties tend to be air power and logistics. And I've been working on that also now in the more modern era in the last few years. So I wasn't a particular Russian army specialist or a Ukrainian army specialist at all. I was sort of an air power and logistics person, and that's what interested me. The reason I've ended up taking part in this discussion is because I was one of the few people before February 24th that was simply saying, why do we think the Russian army is so good, and why do we think the Ukrainians won't fight? Because it seemed to me that people were making very bold claims about Kiev falling in a few days and that the Russian army would be this tremendous army, and based on no track record of it achieving anything to that level. And it hadn't actually fought a war for decades and decades, or anyone had fought back. And it seemed to me the Ukrainians had quite a reasonable reason to want to fight back and fight back with spirit. So it wasn't that I had any idea what the war would really be like. I just didn't have any confidence that the Russian army would be able to do what people said it would do. And I suppose that's how this all started, because I was just asking that question. Why doesn't seem to me that this is a military force that could achieve anything like what people were saying it could achieve? And when I started looking at the war, I thought, okay, I'll look at the things that I know about are air power and logistics. And I would simply pay attention to those in the first part of the war and see what I see. And see what develops. And what I saw for both of them were the Russians fighting in what I would call a really tactically and strategically poor method, not being advanced, not able to operate complex systems in the way that everyone thought they could operate them. There was the famous logistics mess up with the 40-mile column heading down to Kyiv. The air power to this day for the Russians is really disastrous. They're unable to fly over Ukraine for any reasonable period. I mean, the whole fact that Ukraine can use these ranged systems in the last few weeks are because the Ukrainians have been able to keep the Russian fixed-wing aircraft out of Ukraine. It's quite a remarkable achievement. And then what I saw on the other was, in fact, the Ukrainians fighting a more intelligent war. Again, if you looked at both air power and you looked at the logistics war early on, you saw Russia doing things that seemed to me pretty mediocre to poor, where Ukraine was doing things that seemed intelligent and thought out. the way they neutralized Russian air power through the combination of two different kinds of anti-air systems, both the smaller handheld, but then the larger systems, the S-300s, and the way they very intelligently used a small number of fixed wings to basically make it too dangerous for the Russians to fly, was really quite a well thought out plan, I think, in many ways, that it changed the course of the war. And the way that from the very beginning they attacked Russian logistics as the Russians came in, which was very well thought out. So that is probably why I've ended up becoming involved in this debate, is for asking questions and saying that what I was seeing was very different than what people thought was going to happen. And from that point on, I think what I've seen in this war is Ukraine fight a progressively smarter and smarter war. Fighting an intelligent, well thought out war. And it's now one which Ukraine can start turning to its advantage, that it has the longer range systems. And the Russians fighting, to me, what seems to be an increasingly unthought out plan of just one heavy artillery method, but without fighting what we would call a modern combined arms war.
Yeah, there's very few people who, unless, of course, you were amongst those Canadians who trained the Ukrainian armed forces in recent years, and Colonel Melanie Lake, who co-founded Media Aid in that regard, a dear friend of ours, and we support them, made that remark very early on, that they had learned, the Canadians that is, as much as they had been able to teach them in order to help the Ukrainians to progress on that path to a modern Western Army's combined arms capacity, full well knowing that the Air Force was small by comparison to its prospective adversary, that the anti-air and anti-missile defense capacity was by far not sufficient, as we have seen, and that the Ukrainians would have to simply know their territory and their strengths best, and probably find ways in terms of, well, shall we say, not allowing electronic warfare and cyber warfare to take hold of Ukraine and shutting down their infrastructure. And these are the things, as you just highlighted, which the Ukrainians have achieved.
Yep.
And they have repelled the Russians on those matters. As our friend and, very regular speaker and supporter and of the program, Colonel John Spencer, has highlighted many times over, is that the Ukrainians have prosecuted this war to the best of their available capacity very, very effectively. And whilst they had to take losses, but they have fought, and especially these delays they have been fighting and the resistance they have shown in, at times, very, very challenging environment, be it Severodonetsk or now then the very cleverly mounted delay and withdrawal then from Lysychansk, or was it beforehand the defense of Chernihiv and
Sumy.
Northwest, and Sumy, yes.
Yeah.
I was just about to come to this axis, which many people have forgotten, Chernihiv, Sumy, Konotop. That is probably what held up, just like Mariupol, tied up a lot of resources. This is pretty much an astonishing feat if you think about it, and they've planned this well through, and many people have criticized, I don't know why, I don't know what you think about it, but many people have criticized at the very early stage Zaluzhny and the general staff, but I think that they've made the best of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few points actually we could go on there. I really think, I mean, I don't know if you saw it. I was very interested in what the Ukrainian strategy might have been early. So I tried to write an article in The Atlantic that was called The Ukrainian Way of War. And it was simply trying to say, what do we see? I had not talked to Zaluzhny, I've not talked to the Ukrainian general staff, but to try and see what, to see if there's some kind of way of fighting that the Ukrainians have been doing to contend with the fact that the Russians have a lot more equipment and a lot more advanced equipment. And I think what we saw in that axis, the Sumy, Chernihiv, Konotop, all of that, and Kharkiv as well, was a really well thought out plan of denying the cities. Basically, if the Russians really want to get to Kyiv, if that's their goal, keep them from having easy transport through the cities, so they have to go around them and have these cities behind them all the time. get the Russians strung out along the road. I mean, the Russian army just got strung out all the way along the road from Sumy to Kiev and all of that, and then chop into it with small units. And it seemed to me, and actually, you don't do that by accident. What we saw in the Battle of Kiev was to me, it looked a well thought out plan. And that's what I tried to write about in the article, that it seemed to me they knew what they were doing. They took advantage of weaknesses in Russian logistics from the very start. They went after trucks. That was talked about very early in the campaign. If you string the Russians out along roads, they're going to have a real problem with trucks. And the Ukrainians went right after the trucks. In many ways, they were going after the trucks more than anything else early on. And they ground that Russian army to a halt. And it just couldn't move. It was stuck, and all it could do is a lot of the soldiers had to pull back and leave behind their equipment. So that, again, doesn't happen by accident. And I thought that was a really interesting and well thought out plan. I don't know what else they could have done at that point. I mean, if I was going to say the controversial one, and I'd like to hear what other people think on this, was the decision to fight all the way out in the tip in the Donbass. When you look at it on a map, places like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk should have been easy pickings for the Russians because they're so far deep into sort of a crook of the Russian line. The Russians were actually relatively close from the north and the south. They did push a huge amount of artillery into a very small place, and they eventually battered it to heck, and the Ukrainians pulled out, having suffered. We'll only know. I mean, and actually, I'd love to hear what you think and other people think. I think at some point the Ukrainians might have overstated the casualties they were suffering. I mean, they were still undoubtedly heavy, but when you had people talking about a few hundred people dying a day, every day, if that's true, that was maybe not the best choice to make. I don't think it was true because of the way the army pulled out in good order and the way they started fighting the whole time. So if I was going to say if there was one controversial decision, it was fighting at that tip. But on reflection, I would say that probably was the right choice because they've basically kept the Russian army moving so slowly until they got the range systems. The war has really changed since June 30th, July 1st. And it's changed because Ukraine now has better range systems than the Russians, not nearly as many. But what they did is they were willing to expend forces to keep the Russians as far back till the equipment battle turned their way on quality.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. If you don't mind, I would like to point us back to the Battle of Kiev also, and there to the northwest, because there is this amazing setup. Again, good planning, where the Ukrainian armed forces and their engineers opened the dams and flooded the area. And our friend and colleague, as I just said, Colonel John Spencer, has just joined the panel because he had the opportunity to travel to Kiev and analyze the arena and be, so to say, on that axis all the way up to Ivankiv. John, good evening. How are you? Oh, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Actually, I'm quite enjoying the conversation. All I can say is yes to everything that Professor has said up to this point. I mean, I did get to travel. I get to see I agree, lots of planning, probably years of planning with multiple scenarios, right? And as I continue to process all that I saw from walking the ground, from Dmitriev, the flooded village and the flooded rivers. But I mean, like the professor says, you cannot discount area denial. If 1st Tank Guard Division had not held off all Russians from advancing south of Chernihiv, the plan for Kyiv might have not worked. It was luck played a lot in it, but planning and then intelligence, right? So Ukraine lacked no amount of intelligence, although they did I think a historic and will be studied by many militaries intelligence fusion. Taking intelligence from civilians all over the place, taking international intelligence assets, infusing that into actionable maneuvering limited forces, maneuvering limited capabilities to create this block. And I think my personal, I'm a layman, right? So I'm a student. In all these places, it's more for me the Spartan way, right? Give them nothing but take from them everything. So don't give them 1 inch of Ukrainian land without making them pay for it.
That certainly seems to be the what they did in the Donbass. I mean, so when you would, I mean, so I don't mean to move back to that point, but so when you do, and I'd like to actually go back to the Battle of Kiev, but on that last point, do you think that was then worth it, fighting in the tip in the Donbass like that?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. I mean, because they're fighting the information domain as well, right? Yeah. So they can't be they needed, in order to maintain this coalition of international support and weapons flow, they need to be able to show that they're not, the cards aren't falling. So I think what they did in Severodonetsk, not overcommitting forces, not a Mariupol stand of, which was an operational amazing feat, but in Severodonetsk and in that tip was make them to fight for every ground. And then if the Russians, like they did in the first 2 or 3 weeks, create a mistake, they rapidly got a Legion battalion in there and made the Russians pay for that mistake, but then fell back and had a plan for falling back. I think it was a good decision. I mean, they did. We'll never know the casualties that were suffered for that decision, but it made the international community. There is the fight of killing Russians, but this is a geopolitical fight to maintain what they need to win the war.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good. I think that probably is the strongest. Yeah, that's the sort of real strategic argument for doing that choice. But returning back to the Battle of Kiev, I was wondering, did they have that strategy, an actual strategy of stringing the Russians out along roads? Or did the Russians just expose themselves quite rashly? Because it did seem to be they in certain cases let the Russians go down the roads and get sort of in these long columns where they couldn't react to anything.
So, I didn't get access to like a full, like you said, the general staff, right? I got access to the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. Yeah. Clearly there was a rub between a political decision not to be in positions, maintaining an awareness of what the Russian decisive operation was. There's a little bit of both on clear planning of how to utilize a defense in depth, right? Yeah. I mean, most of these battles didn't happen in Kiev proper. This is the peri-urban way out.
Yep.
And there's a couple interesting things of like there's an interesting 11th Mechanized team of people engaging a Russian formation at the way up north, even before the Ivankiv Trackle Circle. Like nobody knows, like why would it? Who was that? What were they doing there? I don't personally think. So I think it was a porcupine strategy, a territorial defenses that were armed. Like it wasn't just the handing out of the rifles en masse on February 25th. They had supplied the different communities with armories at their recruitment centers. So I think they had this total defense plan. They had this plan of how to manipulate the terrain, right? So the decisions of the Russians on when to cross the line and then the weather. I mean, we can study that whether they held off for the China Olympics, or not. But the conditions were not favorable to them, and then long story. I don't think that was it might have been one of the course of action plans, but this defense in depth was clearly a part of the plan. And cutting off all the main roads, like the easy roads, right? This decision to blow 300 bridges, right? So that clearly was a area denial, and that had to be approved by literally the Ministry of Interior because that's national infrastructure.
Yeah.
How they did that so quickly is because they had to plan it. There's no way you can blow that many bridges in that quickly without having planned resources, planned forces, everything. So I think this area denial plan, but I think it went better than they thought it would, right? So this is the Wolverines, the total defense, thing that the civilians that showed up, they couldn't have planned it to have worked that well to take advantage of the planned elements of, taking away all the main avenues that the Russians wanted, the Russians were really trying to come through, right? In Markov and out east and east of west of Sumy, that main access, that they were really searching for a way in.
Well, actually, the last thing I don't want to keep firing questions, Jay, but this is fascinating to me because the third example why I thought the Russians were in trouble right from the very beginning was not just air power and logistics, which seemed to unfold very poorly from the beginning, but actually the way the Ukrainian armed forces react to the Russians taking Hostomel airfield. The Russians got onto Hostomel airfield almost instantly, it seemed, but within 12 hours, the Ukrainians had reacted so effectively that they'd taken the airfield back. Now, again, that can't happen by accident. That has to be a part of a thought-out plan to have a rapid reaction force with enough firepower to get there and to clear the airfield. And plus, the way they might not have expected the Russians to do that. So, I mean, maybe put two questions. Did they actually think the Russians were going to try something like that? Or were they just well prepared enough that they could react when the Russians did?
So I think if they thought the Russians were going to conduct a joint enforceable entry and take airfields, I think they would have done things differently than they did. And this is that political rub of not letting the military be in position. Yep. So the Russians fainted at all the airports, right? In Vasilkiv and in Bohdonki, I mess up the names, in the southeast. Yep. The fact that they got the Russians got 20 helicopters of VDV in, I think it deserves the credit. Well, what happened though is, so I think it was. I don't think it was planned how well Hostomel went for them, because the 4th Rapid Reaction National Guard element wasn't there. Like, even though they're based there, somebody had sent them away to a different location, and it was really what we call the rear D, like the elements behind. But somebody made a decision to keep the artillery there, right? So that's what defeated allowed them to counterattack. They never really have reoccupied Hostomel. They did have forces available to send a special forces element within 6 hours of planning, be a part of that, destroy what's on the airfield. I think for you and me, from like logistical and air power, is that how impressive that the sources that they did have, the Ukrainian artillery was able to damage the airfield enough, right? The Russians occupied Hostomel, a few hours later. I mean, they had to scoop up all the dead paratroopers after the special forces counterattack in combination with artillery. But what I'm most impressed of, as an old ranger who used to practice airfield sieges, is that the Ukrainians destroyed enough of the airfield that it could no longer be used as an air bridge. And that's the fact that they destroyed, most of the VDV, that's great. And that and I talked to the special forces officers who were part of that night attack, instead of just like shooting an arcade, video game, because the artillery would come, Russians would run at them, and they'd just shoot the Russians. But the mounted forces show up the next day, as you know. I mean, the mounted elements of the Russian advance successfully made it to Hostomel and occupied the airport. But they had damaged it enough, which is very interesting, right? So the transport planes that were sitting in Belarus that would have airdropped even more combat power and allowed them maybe to punch from Hostomel to make it to the 15 miles to the headquarters of the Ukrainian government, couldn't land, even if when they secured it. It was that damaged. And I think that's pretty impressive on how you do that with indirect systems. Usually,
and so they had the right ordnance to do that. They had that prepared. They had the right ordnance to take out the airfield. Wow.
Possibly. Usually what you do is you dig up the airfield, right? You use construction equipment, things like that. And like the ISIS did in Mosul and things like that. So I think that's the interesting part of the Hostomel story was, yes, the counterattack was impressive, but there's a little bit of luck there. Had that been Vasilkiv, of course, the 11th Mechanized and the 95th Airborne might have had something to say about that. But there is a little bit of luck. There is a little bit of lack of planning what it was necessary to hold it by the Russians. And they didn't have to hold it for long, right? They just had to hold it till those mounted forces got there. But I would like, if I could go back with all my list of questions to like the general staff, it would be like, how did you destroy the airfield so well?
Wow, what a great story that would be. I mean, I'd love to find out, because that just seemed to be, that whole engagement seemed indicative of something, at the time.
Right, it took the momentum, right? So the
Yeah.
plan of the Russian attack had to have this speed and shock effect, right? Not shock at all. They had to have this in order to get into where they wanted to go. They needed that air bridge. They were still trying without it, but it took away some of their momentum, and they had to respond. And like you said, it's when you can't respond to the friction and the fog of war that you start to get defeated in detail. And that's when your 72 hours doesn't end up working out. And now your logistical plan gets put to the test. And I think Michael Kaufman has said it well enough that, look, that 40 kilometer logistical convoy was never like, it was attacked. It was never fully like, it wasn't stuck. Because if it was stuck, it wouldn't have been able to turn around and just leave. It was not able to do forward logistics. It wasn't allowed to push to the now cut off Russian forces and get them the fuel and things they needed.
No, absolutely. But I mean, that the idea that they thought they could do that in that way is a bit bizarre. Unless they really thought the Ukrainian resistance was going to be so weak.
Well, they thought they could take the airfield and resupply forces from there. That was the idea. This is why this Tochka-U strike on Taganrog in the east, for example, was so important, because it took out a lot of the supplies which would have been airlifted to other airfields. John, I have a question for you. Given the fact that you were there with the SOF, did they use artillery, or did they find other ways to explode the fuel dumps at the airfield?
They didn't answer that question. It sounded like this. This was they had a limited objective of attack, but the Joint Forces Command was orchestrating. This is the thing that was so impressive about the Battle of Kyiv was their ability to allocate their limited from TB2s, which they lost a lot in these first 2 weeks, right? They lost a lot in defending Kyiv, but the 4th Rapid Reaction National Guard's artillery. So I think they used a lot that night in conjunction with covering this Special Forces raid that they directed, because they identified the need like that. If they lost Hostomel, all could have been lost.
You think it was that? It could have been that bad?
Yeah, if those IL, the transporters that we've seen, we knew where they were in Belarus, had a chance to just 8 hours it's what I did. I jumped into northern Iraq, into Bashur as a paratrooper. That was cool. But we held that airfield, and we brought in C-17s to drop tanks and Bradleys, and it didn't take but a day to do that. If the Russians could have gotten those transport planes in, the fight would have went a lot differently.
So I mean, I wonder, and this is a larger question, whether we sometimes, with the problem we had with our evaluation of the Russians, is we fall into what I've actually started calling the American trap, by looking at them as a slightly smaller version of the American military, when really they just are not capable in the same way. Their air power usage seems to me, it's not just a small version of the USAF, it's basically a few leagues down.
No, I'm probably guilty of that as well. Well, people need these similes, though, right? So these light comparisons, just to
because they're not capable in the same way, I don't think. Maybe I'm being too harsh on the Russians, but I've just not seen the kind of to do the complex operations that the U.S. armed forces can pull off, and maybe no one else could pull them off. But the Russians just seem to be a whole different world away from being able to pull off a basic complex operation.
Yeah, I think we discussed it. They don't do it at all. They don't train for it, John. They don't train for the Air Force, and they don't train combat arms.
Right. So I would just modify that a little bit to say joint operations, right? So the air-ground integration with naval, that's something we spend a lot of time on. You have to give not them credit, but you have to be not impressed, but they mounted a very large-scale ground invasion. It's really over 7 advances, and that's their mistake, right? Their planning mistake. That's a lot of combat power they projected in 48 hours to a week.
That it is. I mean, this has brought up something. I mean, I've always, and again, from an outside perspective, I just sit here watching and I don't know really what's going on. Did these losses in the first few weeks, these very heavy losses of the frontline troops, basically rob Russia of the kind of forces that can show initiative because they did show initiative in the first part of the battles, first part of the war. They did show initiative in places. They were able to do these kinds, even though they failed, they were able to do these kinds of more advanced operations. Whereas since they've suffered those losses in the first few weeks, we've seen nothing of that kind of sophisticated, even not as sophisticated as the U.S. would do, but we've seen this kind of real plodding warfare, just artillery-based. And is that because they lost all these troops that actually had the training to try these?
So from my, I'm not a Russia expert. I'm a one-trick pony with urban warfare. But from my understanding it's really the force structure of the Russian military applied, with each military district having their separate objectives. That was another part of their weakness. And when they focus on the Donbass, they bring in an overall commander and they start to combine military district units to be operational on assigned main efforts, rather than every military district who has a bandwidth of professional to not as good units and letting them plan out their objectives by themselves. Bringing that back, using more experienced personnel, and then collating resources. All these things that we say are important in our military, in the operational art, massing, things like that. Some will say that this is just Russia tried something that isn't something they trained, isn't their doctrine in this invasion. Now in the Donbass, they're going back to their more fires-based maneuver, which is lots of fire, push forward, lots of fire.
Yeah, lots of fire, not much maneuver. But,
right. Yeah. No, I agree.
I don't see any maneuver. Really, I mean, the fact is they couldn't close a tiny pincer.
Correct.
So in fact, there's almost no maneuvering going on. It just seems to be clear a space out with artillery and then try to occupy the empty space.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. For maneuver, I'm just doing that military term of fires that support somebody else moving, not side flanking maneuvers or anything. Literally just something shooting in front of me and I'm taking a step forward, shoot. And they're doing at that massive scales. They still outnumber. The artillery that they brought in. It is impressive. I can't even find anywhere it knows exactly how much guns are firing at one time, but it's massive.
It was. We don't know how much they can actually fire now.
Right.
Absolutely.
If you allow me, both of you, I would like to invite our colleague and co-host CJ to enter the discussion, because as an artillery officer in West Pointer, he can, I think, chime in quite easily in that regard. And he had a number of questions too.
Well, no, I would just add a little bit of context to this Hostomel operation, which I think, is such an important talking point, because it kind of is the juncture between the training and the execution, which, is a large gap. And of course, in strategic studies, it's so important to study this stuff, long in advance so you can better predict. In Crimea, March 2021, so about a year before the war started, the VDV did a couple airborne seizure practices where they did a very similar thing. However, the difference was they airdropped in BMDs and self-propelled howitzers and self-propelled mortars in. And what is so interesting to me, and I'd love two of our distinguished guests here to kind of chime in on this, is we saw evidence of, in Belarus, these armored vehicles that were wrapped and ready to be pushed out the plane, but they never seemed to get there or get dropped. Do you think that would have made a difference? And why do you think the Russians didn't do what was in their training, which was to get some mechanized forces and also artillery into the battle? Because I think that would have made a big difference for them.
Well, I think probably the person who was at Hostomel or closer should start first on this, because I can't say. But
no, I mean, I think it's actually an air power question, right? So it was based on the threat that was in a key, whether that was another underestimation, right? So the one SU that gets shot down, there was rumor that a transport plane was shot down in Vasilkiv that first night. No evidence of that. But clearly a major threat, whether that was through air systems they just didn't target or didn't destroy, or the man pads. That's that's outside of my specialty, but clearly became a part of the decisions on why not to do what CJ is saying that they had trained was the threat to the air.
So I think that I do think, I mean, I don't want to be too much of an air power nerd, and I wrote this piece with David Deptula and Ed Stringer on that. And I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that simply the Russian Air Force was not able to, and Russian air power was not able to do what everyone thought it could do. From the very beginning, that the Ukrainians kept it off. Both the fact I don't think the Russians could coordinate, they don't conceptually actually know how to use air power in the way that, say, the Americans or the Israelis do. But the Ukrainians denied them that ability. And everyone, I think, had this vision of modern war to be done by the Russians, like the United States, with air supremacy, which would allow them to tie the Ukrainians down. Ukrainians wouldn't be able to move, sort of like the Iraqis wouldn't be able to move. But they simply have not. They when they use air power, it seems to be very limited for very specific tactical operations. But they can't exercise any control over Ukrainian movement. I've not known that. I mean, I'm stunned to see the Ukrainians driving around on major highways in bright daylight.
So again, I guess then the question sort of becomes, Dr. O'Brien, how do we get this so wrong? Because myself and others were stationed in Europe, trained to fight the Russian menace, and we had this sort of large idea, based on the national strategic directives, all these sort of things to kind of guide our training as to what we could expect. Where is that disconnect between how the Russians train and how they actually employ their forces, do you think?
It's a really tough question, and anything I say now is tentative and will be, I think, there's a group of us who are studying the pre-war evaluations and looking at the war, but it's going to take years to fully understand this. What I think, I mean, there's two things. One, the overall one is because the U.S. in a sense has been the world's leading military power and used military force, there was a tendency to look at other militaries through that lens. And there, the American trap, as I'm sort of calling it. This is my own concept, and therefore we said, if the Americans had the Russian equipment and the Russian doctrine, and they could do these operations, what would they pull off? So there was that overall, I think, problem in the way it was. And by the way, that was probably a Cold War problem as well. This is not anything new. That they basically, I think, during the Cold War, probably overrated what the Soviet Union would have been able to accomplish from that same perspective. The other one is that this is, I think, the analyses that focused on weapons and doctrine and didn't look at the fundamentals of Russian national power and society tended to overestimate what the Russians could do. I.e., if you look at a military force as weapons led by doctrine and training or maneuvers, you have a very different view than if you look at, this is the 11th largest economy in the world with a corrupt system, with not a high motivation to fight, and with no military experience fighting anyone who can fire back. So it tends to be from where you take your perspective. Now, a lot of the analysis tended to be, okay, let's look at a war game. Let's take Russian forces and fight with their doctrine and see what they would do. Oh, and they do really well. But it doesn't ask the question. So if you're looking at the historic comparisons, and all historic comparisons are problematic, and this one is just too, it's a bit like the viewing of Mussolini's Italy in the 30s and then when the war breaks out. Mussolini's Italy is considered a great power, has one of the largest armies in the world. It has what people think is a very well-equipped army. But the society is not an advanced society. It's not a technological powerhouse. The system itself is prone to generals who take a little money here, take a little money there. The soldiers aren't that well looked after. And lo and behold, when it goes in the field, it doesn't perform the way it's supposed to perform. So I would think those are it's not that the fact that they were wrong, because if the Russian army did what its doctrine said it could do, and if they could operate their weapons as efficiently as one would think, maybe they could have done it. But I would think from that, if you take a step back, it's the wrong questions were asked partly. Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does. I know, here in the
Right.
space we talk about Russian combined arms not really following their doctrine, but I think it may be to a
Yeah.
bigger sort of strategic problem in terms of you mentioning, their training not lining up and the equipment being maybe overvalued in terms of the American side. So I really appreciate that answer. Colonel Spencer, did you have a follow up, or Axel? Do we want to go to Hans after?
No, I wanted to go back further to a number of other topics, Professor O'Brien, if you allow us, because John Spencer has been there and has looked at specifically also the whole area up to Ivankiv. I thought we can go back to that ill-fated cordon of trucks and the like. As a preparation, the Ukrainian armed forces achieved, with the assistance of Mr. Reznikov, who had negotiated the deal, immediately after he came into his job at the end of last year, Reznikov perfected the deal to transfer 5,100 German anti-tank mines, which could be easily mounted and were used heavily, specifically in those areas you mentioned, both from Chernihiv along Sumy, Konotop to Kharkiv, but also in exactly that arena all the way up to Ivankiv. It seems that their planning, while it's not perfect, was very well focused on shaping that battlefield. I mean, and John, you've been there, you've seen the road, you went all the way. What was your impression as to their preparation, how to attack those supply and logistics chains?
So I studied, as you know, which I thought would be, I was actually going to follow up, and I unfortunately only have a couple more minutes, was, like Professor said, in studying the Russian doctrine or having those fallacies, I studied I wasn't able to study as much as I needed to those counterattacks on the let's say frozen Russian logistical lines, right? So the doors were closed in Irpin, in other places. The logistical lines couldn't get to now the formations that were basically in defensive holds in Bucha or Irpin. What I studied on the way up to Ivankiv, like you and I have discussed, was how the Russians actually executed a very textbook. Maybe it's because it didn't rely on any air assets. Planned withdrawal, a textbook military withdrawal with heavy amounts of artillery, while still under attack. Now, I know you want to know how the Ukrainians were still successfully engaging, even while the Russians had made a decision to withdraw. But the Russians did hold multiple key bridges, one very vital bridge north of that Ivankiv traffic circle. The entire time that all this was not going their way, and then implemented a very powerful and effective under contact withdrawal. So that's, I wish I could give you more on how they implemented, the logistical strikes, but there's still, again, so much that we don't know. That are questions. I just have better, honestly, I have a lot better questions now than I have answers on what did the Ukrainians, like Professor Brian has, like what was planned versus what was very good adapting to the enemy.
You have to go back soon. I mean, this definitely merits more attention. As you just highlighted, they did this astonishing and well-executed withdrawal. That begs the question, if they were able to do so, not only were they sufficiently well-trained in that regard, but also well-prepared, which begs the question, which was always brought forward as a Russian narrative. Is it really true that their officer corps was not briefed at all? I think it's pretty clear that they had everything they needed there, at least in those attack vectors. They had maps, they were prepared, they knew where to go, they knew how to defend it, and can't pull this off if you don't know at all where you're going.
Yeah, I think from a tactical, right? So tactical, or really at the the main effort, the two military district planning efforts, they had a plan. I agree that it was 72 hours to achieve, that they thought they would achieve phase one. They didn't have good, what we call branch and sequels, to adapt to that, and then have trained that adapting to on the fly under condensed timelines. What people I have talked to that are higher up said that this withdrawing under contact was something that was rehearsed, planned in large scale planning exercise, training exercises.
John, can I ask you a question? So you say you have to go soon. First of all, I want to actually get in touch with you after this because I really, what you say is fascinating, and I'd like to continue this conversation. What is your view as an urban warfare specialist, and you're tops in the game at this, in terms of what we've seen in the Russian ability to do urban warfare so far? I mean, we've seen obviously Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and places like that. What is your evaluation of their ability in that?
So right. So urban warfare is a spectrum across military operations. So to assess Russian capabilities, some of it's unit based. Like there are some. They have shown the ability to do the close fight. I think where they really showed a major inadequacy is in the in the closing of these deep to close and shaping it for their formations, where they really led with their face. And what the Russians faced wasn't necessarily the urban warfare that people like to talk about, like the house to house stuff. They faced the really the understanding the city itself, the infrastructure, and how that those can come into mobility and counter mobility challenges in the urban terrain. But in places like Mariupol, those are different assessments based on the units there who don't have the capability to do. There's nothing I've seen from any Russian fight, to include advances in Severodonetsk, that show the Russians know how to do even the most basic combining of arms in the urban terrain. So the use of engineers, mobile protected firepower, infantry, and fires together. So like other militaries, and they're not the only ones, they didn't prioritize that vital. It's not just a unit base, but vital. Like we say, people fight combined arms, and post World War II, we know it's combined maneuver. It gets really tested when you have to fight this combined arms fight that arguably is there's very little maneuvering happening, but you are taking ground with combined arms teams that take away the defender's ability to hold it. So there's some huge inadequacies that the Russians have shown they have. That they have to destroy what's in front of them to be able to move forward. That's not a acceptable strategy. But every city is different, right? So it's a really hard assessment. I will write about Kyiv, but Kyiv was really a urban terrain denial. So they didn't have the ability to penetrate, which is really the buzzword of the U.S. military, especially ground forces. So that is weird. I do have to go, but Professor, I just friended you. If you want to DM me, I can send you my email. I'd love to continue the
absolutely,
conversation.
John. I really like your work, and I actually think it'd be really good to have a chat going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And Axel, CJ, love you guys. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks. You're a champ. Very lucky to have him. Great leader, a wonderful teacher, and a fantastic analyst. So, CJ, let's carry it away. Professor O'Brien. The thing is,
by the way, you can call me Phil. You don't have to keep calling me Professor O'Brien.
Yes, sir. I'm old school. Won't change. It's all right. No worries. I think we're pretty much equal in age, but that's a different thing. Anyway, the item which was just highlighted by John is that every terrain is different, and that the capabilities the Russian troops have shown and their commanders have shown, at least in 3 operational arenas so far, when it comes to urban warfare, whether they attack or whether they withdraw from it by being denied, doesn't bode well for them. And both CJ and I have looked at our favorite topic at the moment, and that is Kherson, where essentially the next stage battle is about to develop, and a big, offensive is coming up. How do you view in terms of strategy and setup, how do you view from your perspective what is coming?
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated is probably the wrong word to talk about war. We know partly what what the Ukrainians are doing, which is, from what we're seeing, they're I think very intelligently trying to cut off supplies wherever possible, destroy command and control, weaken Russian overall sort of force structure. What I don't know is what their plan is to advance and how they plan to actually advance. They're not going to do, I assume, what the Russians did, which is simply saturate an area, as we heard, saturate an area with artillery and move in it. So they're going to have to try something else. It might be that their hope is to so destroy Russian communications that in many ways the soldiers won't fight as well. But I don't actually know what their plan is to move forward. We can see what they're doing now. But it'll be a great test of what the Ukrainians have learned when they do try to move forward.
CJ, you and I were looking at this now for weeks, and I think our colleague Emin, we both called it out before, that Kherson and the tank country surrounding it will be one of the more interesting battles from an analytical point of view, but also pretty bloody. We've now seen the impact of HIMARS. We've seen the perforation, quite literally, of that bridge. What comes to mind when we look at this in terms of shaping the battlefield, CJ?
Well, I think. Sorry, I was going to say, Phillips, if you could kind of talk a little bit more to Axel's question in regards to how you think Ukraine will act differently, because as you said, you hope they don't do the same thing. But as we sort of kind of stated, the basics in combined arms maneuver in terms of taking a lot of casualties and using a lot of artillery, there's a lot of things that are overlapping in the same. So could you highlight some of the differences you hope to see Ukraine execute in an offensive?
Yeah, I mean, all I will say, I mean, when we talk, what I think they're doing from what I'm seeing is fighting an attritional war to such a degree, and they might not go ahead for a few weeks. I mean, I think they want to weaken the Russian forces so much, bleed them out, deprive them of supplies, which the Russians didn't do to the Ukrainians. The Russians just blew things up and tried to move forward. The Ukrainians just seemed to be doing the opposite, not moving forward, except being very, very careful, a little bit here, a little bit there, sort of nibble. The Ukrainian is nibbling all the way up and down the line, and keep the Russians sort of constantly engaged to the point that the Russians actually don't have the forces, because the Russians don't have a lot of soldiers. So I assume that's what they're trying to do, is to trit them down to such a degree that the soldier shortage becomes so acute for the Russians that they can't start holding a very good line. But that would be what I would think they would be trying to do from watching them in action. It seems to be the plan. I mean, I don't know. They're not going to have air superiority over I don't think either side will have air superiority over the battlefield. If any defender in this war we can see does fight with some real spirit and professionalism, it's not that easy to move forward against modern weaponry. So I really think they seem to be just they want to whittle the Russians down to such a degree that the Russians lose the ability to hold the line. And then if they can make a hole, I might think the Russians will just sort of split apart. But that it will be an extraordinary test. And I'm not the world's greatest land power expert. I tend to look at logistics and air power. But that's what I'm seeing the Ukrainians trying to do in this engagement, is sort of keep the pressure up, don't take any huge risks, and wear the Russians out, because the Russian army is actually not that large. The Ukrainian army is probably considerably larger now in terms of manpower that they can throw into the fight. But I don't know what you think, CJ.
Well, I wanted to bring your attention to some of these recent figures we're seeing from US and UK intelligence, and they kind of speculate that perhaps the Russian military is coming to a more permanent pause in the future, that they've expended 60% of their precision-guided munitions, that perhaps 85% of their entire military is devoted to this certain war. So my question for you, sort of on the more strategic level, is has Russia fully committed to this as a war, or where do you see the ability for Russia to act against NATO or other areas in the future? Because from where we're sitting right now, it seems like they really are tied up in a deep way.
Oh, this is a catastrophe for Russia. I mean, this is what I mean when people talk about NATO beefing up now. That's such a low. The highest priority for NATO has to be to have Ukraine win the war. If Ukraine wins the war, I mean, I don't want to guess how many, a decade minimum till the Russian army can be rebuilt. I mean, look what happened to. I was trying to think this through. The Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. That was 31 years ago, and in 31 years, it took them to make this army. This army that we're seeing, 85% deployed, something like that. 85% of its real combat power is in Ukraine, and it's getting chewed up. I mean, how many years will it take it to rebuild from this to actually be any kind of threat to NATO? I think we're talking decades. So I don't see how the Russian armed forces can represent, for at least 10 years after this a threat, because Russia's economically so weak. This is not you say, okay, Germany rebuilds after the First World War. Well, Germany is the largest industrial economy in Europe at that point. It's one of the high-tech superpowers of the world in the interwar period. It has actually quite a young population. Everything that Russia doesn't have. Russia's not an economic power. It's not a technological advanced country, and it has a demographic problem. So, I mean, from that larger point of view, I don't think we can underrate just how devastating this is to Russia. And that's why, I mean, if you want to guarantee security for Europe for a while, just have Ukraine win the war. And then it is sort of, it's hard to see Russia coming back for a long time.
I'll have a question as to this a little later, pertaining to gradualism, because I think everybody here agrees that Ukraine, not only for its own sake, but also for the sake of long-term security of Europe, needs to win this war, but it needs to win it soundly. Russia needs to be defeated in the battlefield and in such a fashion that it actually leads to a reckoning in society. But having said this, strategic perspective, NATO. I think we have a question from Francis, who came up beforehand and who has been instrumental in setting up the interview. So I would give him the floor for a second. Francis.
Thanks, Axel. Hey, Phil. Thanks so much for being here. And just for the people who are listening in, retweet the space. Let everyone know that Professor O'Brien is in here discussing all things Ukraine. Phil, just to drill in a little bit on one thing that you mentioned there around NATO's top priority being to ensure that Ukraine wins the war. Obviously, we've seen a progressive escalation in the magnitude and the lethality of war material that's been provided by constituent states of NATO to Ukraine. What's your prescription moving forward for the types of support that you think are needed? And in particular, I know you have an interest in air power, and there's now discussions around equipping Ukrainian Air Force with Western airframes. Yeah. So I'm curious to know your thoughts and prescriptions in that space. And more broadly, I'm also interested to ask you about your read on the geopolitical sphere. Obviously, this war has been it's monumental in terms of its implications for global security, right? And with two major European states now acceding to NATO, really the landscape is shifting profoundly. And I'd like to know what your read is broadly on the global security posture and in Europe in particular.
Oh, the first question, I mean, when it comes to systems, I always think it's not the weapon that's important, it's what the weapon does. The great thing to give you, I mean, what has made the real difference in the last 4 weeks? We say HIMARS, but it's not HIMARS as a HIMAR. It's the range and accuracy advantage. And that's what Ukraine now, I mean, Ukraine is not going to match up in number of systems with the Russians, but they don't need to. They need to have this qualitative advantage in a certain specific areas. And that is, one, if they can shoot farther than the Russians, that is shown to be hugely important, particularly if air power is not, the Russians can't use it. So the HIMARS are in a way a form of tactical air power. They're sort of, they can be used so far. So it's range and it's accuracy. You have to actually hit. I mean, that's a major difference between Russian artillery range fire and now Ukrainian range fire, is the Ukrainians can hit things. So anything that can help them with range and accuracy, now that goes up and down the line. That goes to the type of ammunition. We're talking about the super long range. And that goes to the intelligence gathering, which allows them to know what to hit with the accurate systems. So that's what, that's how I would look at it. Now, you can accelerate and escalate up the line if you want to go to fixed wings as well. Had they started preparing the fixed wings back in March, then maybe they'd be ready for some kind of summer offensive. The issue we have now is it's going to take, what I was talking to U.S. Air Force people, they said 3 months to retrain the pilots. They don't know. The infrastructure could take longer. So it does look like fixed wings a way off if they're going to do it, and that won't help with the summer offensive. So it's unlikely you can say get them trained up in NATO tanks by that point. So give them what they can do, but better. Give them better range, better accuracy, better intelligence, and that's what I would concentrate on right now. Geopolitically, it's basically ended the great power era of Europe. And by that, it's done. With Finland and Sweden in NATO, there is NATO. And Ukraine wishes to be in NATO. So that Europe is now, outside of a really weakened and economically distressed Russia, Europe is NATO. And I don't think you have had a situation where European security has been so united since the Roman Empire. And that does have massive geopolitical implications. For Russia, it is basically either Russia, and I know this might sound counterintuitive, either Russia has a generational change and basically signs up, or it becomes a Chinese poodle. But it's hard to see it doing anything else.
As the owner of 3 poodles, I would agree with you. But having said this, very, very clearly, let's put this out there. After a successful war prosecuted and won by Ukraine, we will see an immediate application of Ukraine to NATO, and it will be accepted, because the single biggest, best, and most experienced then land army, having won a war in Europe and having defeated I shall call it Mordor, will have to be, within the Western society, a leading light and a guardian.
Do you want my optimistic hat or my pessimistic hat? If I put my my optimistic hat says yes. That Russia will be so cowed by this, it will go. Russia will have to have this period of introspection. Maybe a political crisis, maybe a new generation of political leaders, which it needs. That what it's not had is a proper reckoning for the failure of the Cold War, and it just has not had that internal discussion and internal realization of what actually it is. So my optimistic hat says yes, that goes on, and then Russia understands it's not an independent great power in the way that too many people, particularly in the West, talked about it. I've actually tried to write about this in The Atlantic. Russia is not a great power. It's a nuclear power, but it's not a great power. And in that case, their opposition to Ukraine joining NATO is really because they have this vision of themselves as almost a competitor power to NATO or a competitive power to the United States, where it's just not in that league and maybe needs to reassess. That's my optimistic mind. My negative mind is that you end up with a just lunatic nationalist leader. It doesn't have to be Putin, who's desperately trying to hold on and rattles, and then it doesn't use nuclear weapons, but then you end up with this real sort of crisis in NATO about whether it's worth having Ukraine in, having already humiliated Russia to that degree. And maybe there's a little, you need to have every NATO country agree to let Ukraine in. And does every NATO country agree to let Ukraine in? I could see a scenario where some didn't. So that's my pessimistic hat, and the other one is my optimistic hat.
I'll differentiate your pessimistic scenario. If Ukraine wins the war, but you have an ethno-fascist dictatorship in Russia as a consequence thereof, in order to suppress whatever fragmentation of the country and whatnot, we can let Turkey go as a NATO member of convenience and have Ukraine in.
It's very hard. You'd have to rewrite NATO to kick Turkey out.
Oh, we should talk about this again when Peter Doran and I are here on this screen, because we've discussed the Montreux Convention as well as NATO's charter many times over. And a friend of the program, General Ben Hodges, who's been with us a couple of times, apart from the level of logistics, which we all seem to share, he also highlighted that obviously at some point in time, the two most important nations in NATO, meaning in this case, the United States and of course Great Britain, have to make a decision as to what to do with Turkey. And that decision can be made, given the fact that Turkey knows that it will never get the F-35s, and the spare parts and a few additional F-16s really don't move the needle, as long as the strategic aims of the current ruler of Turkey are so antithetic to Western society. And I think at some point in time that decision will have to come. But that's just my view, and we don't have to go into this today, because I'd really like to point it back. We have a number of questions, if you allow.
Okay, I have to go get my 4-year-old ready to bed, so I have to leave by 7:15. It's 7:15 in the evening here. So just to say, I have eight minutes before I have to go.
Then we have to rack and stack the questions. We'll go through Raver, Leonard, Nightlight, and Pendolino, and we'll do this quick. Lightning fire around. Raver.
Hey, Professor, I don't have a question. You were talking to John Spencer about the battle for Hostomel. You really need to get in contact with Operator Starsky. He's a friend of the program. He was there. He fought. He's very articulate, and he's your witness you need to talk to.
Can you, if you're on Twitter, can you friend me, and I'll friend you back, and then you can DM me?
Yeah. And Professor O'Brien, I will get you Operator Starsky in touch with you. He's absolutely, Raver is completely right.
Great. I'd love that. Thank you very much, Raver.
Good point, Raver. Thank you. Nightline, then Leonard, then Pendolino.
Thank you very much. Lightning round questions. What does Russia look like as a future as a Chinese?
What does Russia look like as a future? A bit sort of what it looks like now, to be perfectly honest. It looks like a weakened state with very few economic options. All it can do is sell oil, but it will have to buy everything it needs from China, and it will only have influence if China allows it. By the way, China could end this war now. If China wanted to, at this point, it would basically could say to Russia, look, get out. You failed. You've lost. This has to come to an end, because the Chinese are the only way the Russians can get their hands on any technology going forward. And by the way, the poodle ultimate point, I don't think we've ever had a time in modern history where the Russian border is completely undefended. The entire Siberian front of Russia is basically just sitting on Chinese forbearance. They could walk across the border at any time. They could take any part of it. Basically, Russia is undefended. It's undefended on the Finnish border, too, from what people are saying, except for very small units. So Russia is living completely on the forbearance of China at this point as a nation, because the Chinese could just take what they wanted. That's what that poodle looks like. It basically, China now can dictate to Russia.
Knowing that no one in the West is willingly dealing with them anymore because they have lost all credibility and accessibility. Before we go to Leonard, we have a question from CJ. I know he's also short on time. CJ, shoot.
No, I just wanted to, we'll want to know if you can come back, really, is the question. But just wanted to pass on from my father, Stephen Drew, that he really enjoyed those car rides from Newton North to Trinity, 30 some odd years ago. So we really hope you have.
God. Yes, Steve Drew. Oh my God. Yeah. I remember one time the car broke down.
Yeah, that car was very old. So hopefully with that, we can get you back on here, because the amount of questions we have in the DMs is just so large, and you've been so great in the space today.
Sure. I'll come back sometime. That's not a problem.
Much appreciated. Leonard, lightning quick.
I'll make it quick. And thank you very much, Professor O'Brien. It's great to hear your viewpoint from the great old St. Andrews vicinity, and I assume the John Erickson tradition and so on from that neck of the woods. But I have a quick question for you, just relating to perhaps the global picture. And sorry? Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Oh, sorry. You disappeared, but you're back now. I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Okay, so just to get beyond all the great granular details that we've gone through, and I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. But I have a question for you that relates to the overall perspective, and I detect from your accent that you're perhaps not a native Briton, but what it relates to is the differing perspectives we see, perhaps out of the British sector, and contrasting that with what we see out of the U.S. And specifically, it seems that the military analysis out of at least the military sector in the U.S. is very much in support of what the Ukraine has done and accomplished, and shows very much a great appreciation for all the reasons for the success on the battlefield. But there still seems to be some scholarly doubting Thomases. And I just refer briefly to the article by Posner in Foreign Policy, and there seems to be a whole strain there. I'm sure you're very familiar with. But we contrast that to, say, the Ben Wallace perspective in England, and there seems to be a much more acute appreciation for the valor and the bravery and the accomplishments that the Ukrainians have achieved on the ground. And I'm just wondering if you have an explanation or some theory as to explaining the little bit of a difference in the sort of the wavering on one side, as opposed to what seems to be almost a complete commitment to cause in the British side of the equation. So any comments you have there would be helpful. Thank you.
It's a really interesting thing. I'm not sure it's a division between, say, Americans and Brits. And yeah, I mean, I'm born and raised Boston. My family still lives there. Just so ended up that I spent my academic career here in the United Kingdom, but I go back and forth all the time. So I'm a British and American at this point in my life. I think the difference is, and this is going to sound probably. Maybe it's those who invested in the big Russia idea before the war are having a hard time giving it up. And by that, I mean the group that called themselves the realists. And then that was an academic, people like Stephen Walt, John Mearsheimer, a bit Henry Kissinger, a number of the think tank people who built their sort of arguments that Russia's a great power, and therefore, Ukraine should be told what to do. That Ukraine has no agency. And even though what we've seen, in fact, shows that Russia's not the power they thought, and Ukraine is a far more formidable force, I think they just cannot fully accept the reality of what they're seeing. That Posner piece might be an interesting one. They really do have this vision that the Russian army is going to find a way to win this war in the end. And so that I tend to think the difference isn't American and British. It's those who invested in the big powerful Russia idea fully are having a much harder time moving on from that than others who questioned it. And the other difference, and this is, I don't know whether this would follow. It did so much. The active people, the active duty people in both the MOD in London and the Pentagon tended to be a bit more, not pro-Russians, the wrong, but thought the Russians would do better than a lot of the retired people, like Ben Hodges or Mark Hertling or Ed Stringer in Britain. The retired officers were the ones who I talked to or I saw them writing, and they were always the ones who I think really asked the difficult questions about why do we think the Russians are good? Why do we think the Ukrainians are not going to fight? But for some reason, there tended to be a hive mind within the people in the sort of ministries at the time. And that was what I think. But a lot of them have now moved away from the hive mind if they weren't too associated with the big Russia idea. But this is all, by the way, this is all impression that I'm just trying to work it out in my mind. But that's what I see. But it might be that we'll find out, when this is all said and done and we go back and do the data, that it's different.
Mindful of your time. Thank you, Leonard, and thank you, Professor O'Brien. Mindful of your time. Pendolino had his hand up for a long time. Do you still have a minute?
I have 1 minute. Go ahead.
Shoot, Pendolino.
Okay, thank you very much. In order to win the battle for Ukraine, it's decisive that they keep the support from the United States and the UK.
Yep.
If the Kherson operation fails, do you think there will be no longer that support for a win, but rather for a stalemate and for a ceasefire?
I mean, as I've always thought, I tweeted about a long thread. The American public opinion, certainly in war, act very differently than people sometimes think. Americans don't get bored with war. They don't actually react to casualties in war. They react to victory or defeat. So what you asked is a very interesting question. If Ukraine ever looks like it cannot win the war, that will be a very dangerous time for U.S. public opinion. That they'll say, and by the way, that's what happened with the U.S. and Vietnam. It wasn't the casualties that turned the U.S. public opinion against Vietnam. It was the war looked unwinnable in 1968. And you'd say the same thing with Iraq and Afghanistan. The American population really wavered when it looked like these were going to be endless wars with no end. If Kherson is a catastrophe for Ukraine, and so the Ukrainians throw a huge amount of force in, and the Russians just beat them off at huge losses, that will be very damaging for U.S. public opinion. I personally don't think that will happen, but I think that would be the worst possible result. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
So, when do we continue?
Well, we'll arrange that. I mean, I'm away for the next few weeks, and I'm finishing a book, but probably at the end of August, early September would work for me.
By that time, Kherson is behind us. I think if you can shave off half an hour in between, whenever you're writing your book, I think there's a chapter to be written.
Yes, well, I mean, I'd love to actually talk to more of the people who have been there and could talk about what happened on the ground. I mean, I tend to observe all these things, obviously, from a distance and look at long-range things like logistics and air. But I'd like to hear more about the people who are actually there.
Well, send me a message. You see my avatar, which is actually a call sign, and you can actually look at it and you'll find out which unit that was. And then I'll get you in touch with the people, because I think there's a lot of people who have DM'd us and would really like to get this conversation going. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys, and I'll speak to everyone later, okay?
All righty. Thank you. Cheers.
Bye-bye.